So I'm going to try.
Yeah, because if you do, I'd like you to tell people about where you're up to,
Even if I can't, I'll send you an update. Okay. Yeah.
Good evening. Well, welcome. Welcome to the final session of our summer Tony Woiak History Festival presentations. This is the 12th annual year that we have had these presentations, and many of you have been at many, if not all, of the presentations, and hopefully they have been enjoyable, enlightening, informative, as we know our presentation this evening will be. On behalf of the Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Historical Society, who are the joint sponsors of the History Festival, welcome, welcome, and thank you for participating. We really enjoy having these presentations, sharing with you information that perhaps you did not know about Washburn, interesting information, and tonight we're going to go back to 1888 and a calamity that occurred in the city of Washburn. We do have this evening copies of the summer 2023 newsletter from the Washburn Heritage Association, and Mary Gruhl, our president, has some and has passed them out already and is available to pass out more at the end of the presentation. So thank you on behalf of Heritage Association and the Historical Society for joining us on this lovely August evening. I will now invite Dick Olson, my very, very good friend, to come up and introduce this evening's presentation.
Again, I'm supposed to be Gary Holman, but I'm not. This is going to be a great presentation because on that very picture you're looking at, my great-grandfather Greenwood had a meat store, and I want to learn about it. I hope Pete can enlighten us a bit on it. The other thing is, it established the Washburn Fire Department, and I got on just after that. Peter Mann is going to be our presenter this evening, and although his professional career has been in the fields of environmental science and public administration, he delights in the exploration of place, inquiring about why communities are the way they are. He has been fascinated with the heritage of the region ever since he first set foot on the shores of Chequamegon Bay as a youth. Since his retirement from the City of Ashland as city administrator in 2015, and before that he was our city administrator from, I think, 2002 to 2006, and so he is a historian. He might fill that in. He's had the opportunity to spend more of his time investigating aspects of the region's community history. Pete resides in Ashland with his wife Diana. When not traveling to visit his grandkids, he delights in becoming further acquainted with the area's foundations. I introduce Pete Mann.
Thank you, Jay. Just one housekeeping thing before I get started. My spouse has threatened me with bodily harm if I don't hold this microphone in front of my face. So if I start drifting away, let me know before she does, okay? Thank you. There's a sign. There's a sign on the front door of the Washburn Fire Department. This thing worked just fine until now. There we go, thank you. That says or implies that the fire department has been fighting fires since 1880. And it's kind of gotten my goat every time I drive by that building. And I say, huh? Washburn didn't exist until 1883. And the fire department didn't come into existence until several years later. I asked Bob Wolfram one year why that date was selected for the sign, and he said that's what they were told, but it sure couldn't have been from the city's three eminent historians, Chick Sheridan, Tony Woiak, or Lars Larson, because they all, I imagine, would have different dates. In 1880, Washburn, the city to be, as noted by Lars Larson, was nothing more than a wilderness of a forested hillside running down to clay bluffs and sandstone outcrops on Lake Superior. There was hardly a need for a fire department in 1880, 81, or 82. The first settlers didn't arrive on the shores of Washburn to establish a community until May 12, 1883, when they got disembarked from the steamer City of Ashland. And surveying of the township didn't begin until the next month. But this frontier town grew rapidly from that point forward. And just to give you a little orientation to this map, Central Avenue is the yellow line that you see there, and it runs from up the hill down to the waterfront and eventually to what we called the coal dock in later years, and past Dan Corning's store. Dan Corning had erected the first building in Washburn, and it was a store that was oriented towards the construction camp building the docks. The railroad depot from the Omaha was on First Avenue East, the Pioneer School was up where the courthouse is, and the roundhouse for the railroad was at the foot of First Avenue West. First Avenue East ran down next to the depot, and there wasn't any town hall at that time. The city, or the settlement's clerk, resided in the Pioneer School. It wasn't long before the first fire occurred in Washburn. It was also May of 1883 at a boarding house that was built by a gentleman by the name of Snow that was oriented towards the workers of the construction camp. Snow constructed what Larson refers to as a shanty for laborers, and it burned from a brush pile fire next to the building 2 weeks later. The second big fire in Washburn occurred the following November, and it was the Swain boarding house. Swain built a boarding house down by the construction camp as well to serve the laborers that were building the docks. After this building burned, he built a 3-story structure that could comfortably serve 110 clients and guests until it burned again in 1895. The settlement didn't really start taking care of its own affairs until April of 1884, 1 year after the arrival of the first settlers, when the first meeting of the town board occurred after the town was offset from the town of Bayfield. There were only 2 items on the town board agenda that evening, and a fire department wasn't one of them. They wanted to appoint the police chief and the all-important establishment of a saloon license fee. The saloon license fee was essential to the financial security of the township. It was the revenue source that paid for the bills. I'm getting ahead of myself now. In October of 1884, the very first edition of the Washburn Itemizer, the first of several newspapers that would eventually serve the community, the editors noted, if there is one thing which Washburn needs more than another, it is an organized fire department of some kind. The editors continued, like all new towns, Washburn is composed entirely of wood buildings, and some of these days, if proper precautions are not taken, There will be a blaze which, if it does not sweep the town entirely out of existence, will destroy thousands of dollars worth of property. Later that year, a fire occurred in the Washburn Hotel. And if it wasn't in the kitchen of the Washburn Hotel, this was the hotel that was built where Legion Park is today. And if it wasn't for the energetic efforts of many of the hotel's residents and citizens of the community, the whole building would have been lost. The event added weight to the pleas of the itemizer's editors for the establishment of a fire department, but nothing was done. In October of 1886, the first sawmill in Washburn, constructed by S.G. Cook and Company 2 years earlier, burned. And yet the establishment of a fire department was not part of the town board's conversations. A year later, the lumber yard of the C.C. Thompson mill was damaged by fire to the tune of $50,000, the equivalent of $1.5 million in 2022 dollars, according to the web-based CPI inflation calculator. And still, no action on the establishment of a fire department. Fire has always been a hazard of frontier communities, particularly those that are based on the forest products industries. Local history, as you know, is full of terrible conflagrations, including the fire that destroyed Peshtigo, the Chicago fire on the same night, Phillips, Hinckley, and Mason in 1894, just to name a few. And I would have thought that fires of that sort would have been confined to history until the last couple of years, if you've been paying attention to the news. There are numerous reports in historical chronicles of folks across the bay in Ashland watching the orange glow of fire in the woods outside Washburn during the nighttime hours, wondering if our community was doomed. In several cases, that was almost true. Harvey Irish, whose family was among the earliest of settlers, notes in his memoir of early Washburn that attending the Pioneer School, the site of the present-day courthouse, he and his fellow students would watch through the windows the woods burning less than a half a mile from the school building on warm, dry fall days, as if it was an expected everyday experience. But the worst fire that Washburn would experience, if one discounts the occasional burning of the mills and lumber docks, was the destruction of the community's primary business block in 1888. Chick Sheridan, publisher of the Washburn News some 88 years after the event, referred to the fire as the worst disaster in its history. The first efforts to gauge Washburn's susceptibility to fire likely came from private sources. Certainly, the privately operated news outlets of the community expressed their concern. They urged the community at every opportunity to get serious about fire protection. The fire insurance industry took notice as well. Companies came into existence in the late 1800s to measure a community's vulnerability to the fire demon for the purpose of assisting insurance companies, or giving insurance companies the ability to measure risk exposure from insured clients. They came out with maps such as the one you see here. This is a Sanborn map, and it drew detailed maps of portions of urbanized areas of American communities of interest to insurers. Those areas tended to be industrial districts and urban centers. The earliest map I found of Washburn was a Sanborn fire insurance map from 1886 in the collection of the Library of Congress. Although the map shows the development of the block that burned in the Great Fire, the most telling part of the map is its analysis of the community's preparedness to fight fire found in the legend of the map. Population 1,500. No steam and no hand engines, no independent hose carts. Water facilities, not good. It also noted the capability of private entities in fighting fire on their particular industrial establishments. In this case, the Omaha's elevator, built in 1886. It notes that there's a Gordon and Maxwell steam fire pump in the engine room, 50 feet of 2.5-inch hose attached, 3-inch water pipe and elevator with 3 hose connections on ground floor, bin, machine, and scale floors, and 50 feet of 2.5-inch hose attached to each connection, 10 water barrels, and 20 buckets on each floor. The 1886 map also showed 2 of the lumber mills in town. The Cook Sawmill also had a night and Sunday watchman, had a steam pump, 50 feet of 1.5-inch hose attached in boiler room, 150 feet of 1.5-inch hose attached someplace, 20 water barrels distributed through the mill and yard, and this is the part I really like. Mill painted on outside with fireproof paint. I'm not sure what that is. And the Root Maxwell sawmill, a similar thing. 350 feet of 2-inch hose attached to a pump and mill, and on the roof with barrels on the roof, end mill and yard, roof painted with fireproof paint. A bird's eye view of the village drawn about 1886 shows the settlement was concentrated in an area just upland from the Omaha docks between 2nd Avenue East and Washington Avenue, and from Omaha Street to 3rd Street. That's the area in the red circle. John Jacobs, in his reminiscence about the community, noted that the whole block between 1st Avenue East and Central Avenue was built up in business places, the focus of our story. And this is the Sanborn map from 1886 of the block that burned and the surrounding blocks. Central Avenue, 1st Avenue East, and this is the block that burned in the 1888 fire. It shows on the map those buildings that are built of stone, those buildings that are built of brick, and those that are built with a combination. You'll see the Opera House has a pink outline on it, has a brick veneer around the building, a wood frame building. All the other buildings are shaded in yellow, which indicates wood frame. And the green colors are kind of a mixture of stone and brick. And this is all the items labeled on that map. What's kind of intriguing is that down where the radio station is, down at Omaha and 2nd Avenue East, 2nd Avenue West, excuse me, was a business called the Washburn Iron Works. The Swain boarding house was built up here at Bayfield and 1st Avenue West. The Sheridan block was where the DuPont Club is now. The Greenwood Meat Market was about mid-block on Bayfield Street. Hotel Washburn is up by Legion Park. The City Drugstore was on 1st Avenue East in Bayfield, where the Forest Service office is today. The Opera Block is where the Opera Block is today. And what is really curious is that the Omaha Depot is on Omaha, of course, on the west side of 1st Avenue East. But if you look at later editions of the Sanborn maps, the depot was moved to the east side of 1st Avenue East. I don't know why. The library at this time was in the Washburn News office, which was again mid-block on Bayfield Street. And Meehan Clothing and Nelson Plumbing were in a wood building. In 1886, the town of Washburn let contracts for the building of its first town hall on the northeast corner of 2nd Avenue east of Bayfield Street, the site of today's Department of Natural Resources office. The building was accepted by the town board in May of 1887. It was a modest two-story building that contained a hall and courtroom and town offices on the second floor, a baking apartment at the front of the building on the first floor, with room for a police and fire departments at the rear. The building had two towers, one in the front for a proposed clock and a larger tower toward the rear for a fire alarm bell, and I suppose the hanging of canvas hoses for drying. Although this is the first mention I have found in the record of the community working toward the establishment of a fire department, the town didn't think much of allocating monies for a fire service. The community's citizenry and elected officials believed the biggest problem in town was the rowdiness and lawlessness from the large transient population catering to forest products industry, the docks, and the community's many saloons, not the imminent danger of fire. 4 years after the founding of the community, a space had finally been established to house this expected public service, but equipment and manpower had yet to be appropriated to make it functional. 1887 was also a year that agitation from the press and some of the community citizenry prompted the town board to work on beginning the establishment of a waterworks, an important component of any municipal fire suppression system. On June 30th of 1887, the town board adopted a resolution that stated, "There is a great and immediate necessity for adequate protection from fire and for a further supply of water. The town board was authorized to take such action and enter into such contracts for protection from fire and the erection of waterworks as may be seen best to such a board." With that resolution, an ordinance was adopted and a contract entered into for the construction of a water system. But according to Larson, there the matter rested until 1889, the year after the Great Fire. A year later, 2 months prior to the fire, the town board seemed to have been finally cajoled into action. Perhaps the destruction of the Washburn Ironworks by the fire demon the same month, or the destruction of the shavings house of the C.C. Thompson Lumber Company provided the instigation. Or perhaps it was the continual agitation of the community's two newspapers. The Itemizer had been persistent in pushing for the establishment of a fire department since the paper's founding 4 years earlier. Now the Washburn News was piling it on. "Down at Grantsburg," the news said, "they are making an attempt to organize a hook and ladder company and want the town to buy a truck, buckets, etc., etc. If our waterworks don't come along, why wouldn't it be a good idea to try the same move here?" The town caved and ordered a complete hook and ladder outfit at its meeting of June 25th, 1888, but once again balked at making the purchase functional. The board made no provision to provide the manpower necessary to utilize the equipment. This hook and ladder outfit was from the Ferndale, California Volunteer Fire Department, and though it is on a trailer, the cart itself had wooden wheels and it had a rack for long extended ladders and hooks on the side of it for buckets to carry water. But it didn't have much more equipment than that. And you didn't use horses to pull this contraption. It was pulled by manpower down the street. Despite the arrival of the hook and ladder outfit in Washburn, the community remained pretty apathetic to the need for a fire department. The Washburn News announced that the meeting called the previous Thursday for the purpose of organizing a hook and ladder company was sparsely attended. A committee of Laf Rowler, G.F. Hulbert, and James Hickey were appointed to solicit interest among community citizens and perfect the organization for the company. On July 28, 1888, the Washburn News provides the first mention of an equipped, staffed, and organized firefighting presence in the community. This appears to be a loosely affiliated group of Washburn citizens who, in the newspaper's words, were financially interested in the town. This does not appear to be an organization sponsored or sanctioned by the town board, though it had use of the town's hook and ladder outfit. The Washburn Hook and Ladder Company met on July 23, 1888, according to the paper, to organize and elect the following officers. Laf Ryder was foreman, G.F. Hulbert was the assistant foreman, E.P. Chatfield secretary, J.A. Sheridan treasurer, E. Hake steward, and Oleani captain of the Pale Brigade. The new company engaged in training on Friday, August 3rd, and the Washburn News reported that the company did very credible work for the first time. Then it happened. In the early morning hours of Friday, September 14, 1888, disaster struck. The Ashland Daily News was the first to report on the disaster. The offices of Washburn's two newspapers were consumed in the fire. In its early edition, a mere paragraph was devoted to the blaze. Devouring fire. Washburn swept by fire at a late hour this morning, entire block already burned. Fire still sweeping over the town. The Hotel Washburn in imminent danger. Meager details, losses not known, read the headline. The text that followed. Washburn, Wisconsin, September 14th, 4:10 a.m. Washburn is sorely stricken. At this hour, the entire block of buildings directly back of the depot and between it and the Hotel Washburn is burning and is all nearly consumed. The paragraph continued that buildings on adjoining blocks are in danger, and it is, at this hour, it is impossible to estimate the damage that has occurred. In the Ashland Daily News, 11 a.m. edition, it proclaimed, "Gone in smoke, Washburn's biggest block destroyed, business houses burned, over $112,000 lost in the seething flames." There were no witnesses to the start of the Great Fire. And speculation arose as to how it happened. According to Chick Sheridan 88 years later, as to the source of the fire, there are all sorts of stories told, but probably none of them are correct. One claimed that the blaze started in Isolil's meat market. Another, based upon an interview undertaken by the Ashland Daily News reporter of Gus Jordan, said to have been the first to discover the fire. "The first I saw of the fire was in the barn. Don't think that the meat market was ablaze when I arrived. It took a few seconds for the barn to burn. The fire spread rapidly to the adjoining building." A team of horses owned by H.H. Gordon were placed in the barn by the driver of the hack. A hack was a horse-drawn taxi. Shortly after midnight on the night of the fire, the hack driver commented that a man who regularly slept in the barn by the name of John O'Brien was lying in the hay reading by lantern light. O'Brien fell asleep a short time later and was awoken by a dog named Roxy about 2:15 a.m. as the fire was raging in the barn. A carelessly handled lantern was suspected of starting the blaze, reminiscent of the lore of the start of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. From its beginning, From its beginning, about 2:10 a.m., near the southwest corner of the business block, Central and Omaha Street, the fire grew in strength, pushed by a brisk southwest wind. Within several hours, the entire block was consumed. The Ashland Daily News reported under its Washburn September 14, 10 a.m. byline. As the heavy smoke clears away over the block and charred embers of what was at midnight the richest business block of the prosperous town, the stricken citizens are able to discover the extent to which they have been scourged by the fiend. The wildest excitement which prevailed all night has died away in a measure, and the sufferers by the fire are calmly contemplating as to what course to pursue. The news estimated that only 1/8 of the loss was covered by insurance. The entire business block, bounded by Bayfield Street on the north, Omaha Street on the south, Central Avenue and First Avenue East, went up in smoke. The news suggested that 25 buildings were consumed in the blaze, though higher numbers were reported elsewhere. The news indicated that most of the buildings destroyed were solid blocks, though that type of structure was not defined. It noted that several buildings were brick structures. Businesses were not the only structures consumed in the fire. The block was filled with the living quarters of village residents. Proprietors of early businesses often occupied living quarters on the upper floor of their establishments, and if not on the upper floors, at the rear of the main floor of their establishments. The block also contained several boarding houses for the community's growing population. News reports did not note any loss of life due to the fire, though contemporary reports, perhaps sensationalized, suggested that some residents barely escaped with their lives, and injuries did occur. The most notable close call is perhaps the experience of Dr. F.L. Bradley and another man. They were completely cut off from escape from the F.J. Meehan clothing store and ended up jumping through a window. The doctor's hair and beard were badly burned, as were his hands. There were several barns and blacksmith shops in the block, but only one horse was reported cremated in the blaze, the horse belonging to H.H. Gordon at the origin of the fire. The news couldn't help its coverage of the fire that day without a bit of editorializing. The sad need for a waterworks system was too late stamped upon their minds. One of the first buildings lost in the fire was the telephone exchange, which prevented communication of the situation to the outside world. The fire was discovered in Ashland from the red glow that Ashland residents often viewed coming from the far shore of the bay. In the case of Washburn's Great Fire, it was reported in the early morning by the staff of the Ashland Daily News retiring from putting out the next morning's paper. The fiery clouds overhead took the staff to the bayfront, where the truth was too manifest to have room for doubt as to the cause. An effort was made to telephone, but without avail. The telegraph office, about ready to close, was a successful medium of communication, and the facts were soon in type and on the press in the first edition of the paper. Ashland did react to the fire and attempted to send manpower and assistance to the community aboard the steamer Emerald. Ashland Fire Chief Scott went down to the Wisconsin Central Dock with his department and one fire truck to have it shipped aboard the Emerald to Washburn, but the fire truck would not fit on the steamer, and so they stripped it of all its implements and tools, and they boarded the vessel with 20 firemen and citizens for Washburn. But the dancing, twisting of the flames as the day broke were fanned by the always fresh breeze that heralds the separation of night from day as the boat neared the shore of Washburn. It seemed as if partly spent The partly spent element had received new impetus and would swallow what was left of the town. Unfortunately, the fire had consumed the block within a half hour of the arrival of the Ashland assistance. The sidewalks surrounding the burning block looked like a flea market. They were lined with articles including personal effects, furniture, safes, groceries, liquor, and clothing removed from the burning buildings. Judge Wharton was reported to have saved most of his law library. The Washburn Itemizer managed to save the bulk of its type, permitting it to use the presses of the Ashland Daily News to put out the first post-fire local newspaper 6 days later. The Washburn Library was consumed when the offices of librarian Fred T. Yates, the publisher of the Washburn News, went up in flames. In one instance, a barrel of whiskey was saved from a burning saloon. The owner stood by protecting it from looters on the boardwalk across the street. That ski had a narrow escape, he said, and I don't propose to lose it now. The Great Fire of 1888 was not Washburn's finest hour. Excitement ran high, according to Larson, but it was impossible to gather a force of men to do any good in any particular direction. The town considered the fire as an excuse for wild celebration. Although some meager assistance was offered by onlookers, the majority did little to assist firefighting efforts. Those who were present, who did not flock to the unthreatened saloons to imbibe or help residents remove personal property from their burning buildings, stood as obstacles in the way of those attempting to provide assistance, and others took devious advantage of the situation. Some in Washburn did attempt to confront the fire. Sheridan reports that Captain Lafrauder of the Washburn Hook and Ladder Company mustered together 6 or 8 men and rushed to the town hall for the hook and ladder outfit purchased by the town 2 months earlier. Larson describes the vehicle as a cart needing manpower to pull it to the site of use. They hauled the cart the 2 blocks from the town hall down to the intersection of Central and Bayfield, where they attempted to persuade 20 others to assist them in battling the blaze. The reply received was an oath or a laugh. Captain Rauder and his meager crew were soon on the ground working like Trojans, reports Sheridan, but the odds were against them. The cart was abandoned and the outfit turned in and worked with a will to save what they could from the burning buildings on Bayfield Street. The truth of the matter, according to Larson, was that without a continuous and ample supply of water, there was nothing to be done once the fire gained headway among the flammable wooden buildings on the block. The fire singed structures on the adjoining blocks. The only building consumed outside of the burning block was Johnson Brothers Blacksmith Shop on the east side of First Avenue East. Johnson did rebuild his business as a wagon shop, and he had living quarters on the 2nd floor, and it burned again 5 years later. The Hotel Washburn Washburn Hotel across Bayfield Street from the burning business block was threatened by fire as well. The news reported that a brigade of men were at work on the hotel, some fastening wet blankets to the roof or windows, and others passing the scant supply of water to the places where it would do the most good. It was a close call. The building on the side next to the burned district bears the marks of the struggle. Similar tactics were used to save the city drugstore. It was toward this building that the tongues of fire made leaps from the opera block. And it was only by the most heroic work that they were warded off by the battling citizens with blankets and a meager supply of water. Had the fire secured a foothold here, another valuable block would have been consumed and residential portions of the town put in danger. To add to the continuing tragedy, possessions retrieved from the burning buildings were stacked on the wooden sidewalks that lined the street, and took a hold of portions of the wooden sidewalks across the street from the burning block. It spread like a prairie fire through the dry wood, consuming everything that was placed upon it. The saloons that did not burn did a booming business during the blaze. Beer ran as free as water as folks grabbed drinks with which to watch the flurry of activity instead of offering any semblance of assistance. The Daily News reports that considerable thieving of the most despicable kind occurred that night. Looters emerged out of the darkness to scavenge anything within easy reach stacked along the sidewalks, adding misery to those who escaped the tragedy with minimal personal effects. Many who had grabbed their choicest possessions while fleeing the fire were despoiled by a gang of ruffians who did their work with boldness. And an abnormally high number of break-ins did occur in other distant parts of town as thieves took advantage of the gathering of citizens to watch the uptown spectacle, leaving their premises vacant and law enforcement officials occupied. Even the Washburn Hotel was the site of thievery while the fire was in progress. Someone entered the room of a hotel occupant, Mr. Sawyer, an agent for the Northwestern Fuel Company, and stole his cuff buttons and in his cuffs on the table. But the most extensive stealing was the clothing that was taken from the F.J. Meehan clothing store. These items again were stacked on sidewalks outside the burning buildings, and people just walked off with a new wardrobe. What seems to have driven the Great Fire of 1888 was the presence of dry wood buildings packed tightly together on 25-foot lots with a stiff breeze out of the southwest, as reported by the Ashland Daily News, along with the neglect of the community to prepare for such an incident. The Washburn Itemizer describes the buildings in the block in its first edition after the fire as all wood with the exception of the upper block, and were as dry as tinder and burned like chaff. All it took was a spark, a man's built environment did the rest. The morning after might have seen a community in shock. The block was traversed as the block fire traversed was a blackened mass. The smell of burned wood permeated the community everywhere. Smoke continued to swirl from the remains of buildings. Occasional flames were seen dancing from unburned timbers, and a bright red glow was emitted from the many piles of coal that had been stockpiled in sheds, basements, and backyards by property owners preparing for the winter heating season. Communities respond to these types of disasters in multiple ways. Many created special building codes for central business districts, permitting only the construction of masonry buildings. The Ashland Daily News predicted in its reporting of the disaster that handsome stone and brick business blocks will spring up from the ashes of the destruction. In an interview with a station agent from the Omaha Road, Mr. L.M. Dickerson, he shared with the paper's reporter that the places of those wood buildings will be taken by good brick blocks as soon as the debris can be removed. The Bay Land Improvement Company, the land company that founded the town, offered an incentive for rebuilding in brick or stone. The company appropriated $2,500 to be distributed among those who rebuild with masonry based upon the value of the building erected. Even the Itemizer reported that the indications are that the entire block will be rebuilt and mostly brownstone and will ensure against further disturbance by fire on the block. For the most part, it was not to be. The city, or I should say the town, did not establish any new building codes. And although masonry and brownstone replacement buildings were constructed within the block, and they stand to this day, most once again were composed of wood, several of which were moved into the block as soon as the ashes cooled. Washburn's recovery began immediately after the fire. The Monday following the fire, a meeting was held in the town hall. According to Larson, very generous offers were made by the quarries, the lumber merchants, and the railroad toward reconstruction of the burned area with new stone block. Larson doesn't say what the offers consisted of, but it would be safe to assume they consisted of materials and the cost of freight to deliver them to the community. The September 20th edition of the Itemizer noted that D.M. Maxey, Billy Burns, Charles Flynn, W.H. Ferguson, Ani and Overby, and M.A. Fitzpatrick all have construction underway to replace what was lost. The September 29th edition of the Washburn News, the first edition of the paper since the fire, destroyed the paper's offices on Bayfield Street, noted that Washburnites have a new way of dating occurrences, before the fire or after the fire. The Washburn News never provided a full report of the fire. It expended its ink and resources describing the tidbits of the recovery, interspersed in the 8 pages of the weekly publication. Billy Furlot bought a building and moved it to his old shop location on what is now, and it is now set up and ready for business, read one report in the Washburn News. Dan Corney is operating the Pioneer store out of the city drugstore on the northeast corner of First Avenue east of Bayfield Street, site of today's U.S. Forest Service Ranger Station. Carpenters were repairing the damage for the Washburn Hotel. N.N. Hansen was running his saloon out of the Medford House. Peter Nelson was in St. Paul purchasing new stock for his hardware store. And Andrew Ani and Juno Overby were in Milwaukee to purchase brick and building materials for a new opera block. I mentioned earlier that Dan Corney built the first store in town down by the docks. After he outgrew that building, he had a store in the opera block. And I think you can see it right here. And Annie and Overby operated a saloon next door to his store in the opera block as well. This is a photo of the block that burned after the fire. Again, First Avenue East is right here. And this is Bayfield Street, of course, the opera block. And I think Central Avenue is at here. And I think this is Meehan's department store, clothing store right there. What's kind of unique about this picture is that the street's dirt, the wooden sidewalks have turned to concrete, and it must be a year or more after the fire because we have a fire hydrant. Unfortunately, after you look at this photo, I think I gave you the wrong building as Meehan's department store. I think this clothing store. I think this is it. This is the. I think the brownstone where the dentist's office is. Most of the buildings in the block are wood again, unfortunately. They weren't the handsome brownstone and brick buildings that everybody was predicting would occur. The October 10th issue of the Washburn News continued with the recovery news. It reported that F.J. Meehan was looking for laborers over in Ashland to work on the new Meehan block under construction at the corner of Bayfield Street and Central Avenue. John Starr was framing up a new boarding house on Omaha Street, and additions were underway for the Washburn Hotel, and a month later the whole building was repainted so that the scars of the fire disappeared. Masons began laying bricks for the new opera block on October 10th, 1888. And by November 24th, the news proclaimed it is hardly 2 months since the fire, and look what has been done. A whole square block, which at the time was laid in ashes, is now comfortably occupied with new and substantial buildings, 4 of which will be fireproof. The town board didn't sit idly by either. They had finally decided that they needed to provide protection for the community. October 6th, just 2 weeks after the fire, the board appointed a night watchman for the community. And though the unincorporated village did not provide a description in the paper as to what the night watchman's duties were, they also indicated that a town fire warden was appointed. And the town fire warden's purpose was to examine any dwelling house, outhouse, lot, yard, enclosure, or building of any description, or any place where fire is used or shavings or ashes are kept, and remove any unsafe combustible materials at the owner's expense. The ordinance provided a fine of $50 to any individual who hindered the effort of the warden, the equivalent of a fine of $1,500 in 2022, according to an inflation calculator on the web. Life Ryder was appointed the fire warden. He was also the captain of the First Hook and Ladder Company. The board also approved expenses of $56 to send Ryder to travel to Chicago to purchase fire engines. The board arranged for the demonstration of 2 Hudson chemical fire engines, and they arrived on Thursday, October 25th, and were tested that evening. The Washburn News reported the test did not result in a favorable showing for the engine. In fact, it was an utter failure. The inventor of the engine, Mr. Hudson, was present for the test, and he claimed the chemicals used were bad. He shared with the paper that the town would not have to purchase the apparatus until the satisfactory test was accomplished. The paper reported that another trial will be given on the engines in a day or so, when Mr. Hudson hopes to redeem his promises and make a favorable impression of his invention. Hudson's giant Fire King chemical engine worked to perfection when retested the afternoon of October 30th. 3 fires were extinguished without exhausting half of the capacity of the engine. The paper notes that the test was a severe one. 3 buildings were kerosened and lit on fire. They were very hot fires, and one was very difficult to control, but the chemicals put it in check immediately when being applied. The news concluded that the engines were excess. It's beyond question that they will prove to be a valuable protection to Washburn against fire. On October 31st, the town hired Gilbert Olson to take charge of chemical engine number 2 at a salary of $20 a month beginning November 1st, 1888. However, the town seems to have reorganized the department once again a month later. The town also hired Richard Greenwood as janitor for the town hall and fire company number 1 at $45 a month. The town hired a contractor to construct an engine house near the central part of town to contain the chemical engines for $300. The location was reported to be complete with a new fire alarm system bell to wake folks up when there was a conflagration. The new station was constructed on the northeast corner of Washington and 2nd Avenue West, according to Sanborn maps. I think this is a picture of that building, and it's behind the Senex station. And the reason I think that this picture was a central firehouse is because of the angle of the street to the building. I think this is Washington Avenue. And the building was not perpendicular to Washington Avenue. The tower with the alarm bell is provided on the building, as well as, I imagine, a later used for drying hoses. I don't know when this picture was taken or what the occasion was, and I'm not sure what all the initials stand for on the sign. We do get the H Hook and Ladder Company number 1, and the W is probably Washburn, but I'm not sure what the rest of the letters stand for. Interestingly, there are 10 people in the photo, and I'll get to that in a second. The loosely organized Washburn Hook and Ladder Company proved pretty ineffectual in combating the Great Fire of September. Reorganization of the community's firefighting efforts was in order. The town board adopted an ordinance creating a fire department for the town. The ordinance is not dated, but first appeared published in the December 8, 1888 edition of the Washburn News. Interestingly, the new department was not designed to protect the entire township. And you've got to remember, back then Washburn was a very large township. The ordinance provided a fire limits that covered just the platted portions of the town, essentially the urban footprint of the settlement. I have to wonder if that included protecting the lumber mills, because they were not on platted lands. The ordinance established one hook and ladder company whose headquarters was designated as the town hall. 3 chemical engine companies were established. Washburn Company number 1 was located at the town hall. Schwamigan Company number 2 was located at the engine house on Washington Avenue that I showed you a few slides back. Hulbert Company number 3 was located at the G.F. Hulbert boarding house and saloon on 8th Avenue West, adjacent to the Omaha tracks. The ordinance prescribed a department staffed by 32 firemen. As follows: Hook and Ladder Company, 10 men. There were 10 folks in that photo that you saw a few slides back. Chemical Company number 1, 10 men. Chemical Company number 2, 10 men. Chemical Company number 3, this is the G.F. Hulbert Company, 2 men. Each company was to select a foreman, assistant foreman, secretary, and treasurer among its members, and make its own laws and regulations not inconsistent with the laws of the state or the settlement of Washburn. The assignment of manpower to company number 3 is puzzling. Again, this is where the central engine house is located. The Senex station is in the triangle at the corner of Washington Bayfield, and just up from where 2nd Avenue West would come in was where the central engine house is located. The assignment of manpower to company number 3 is puzzling. This is the Hulbert boarding house company. The paper doesn't describe the thinking behind shorting company 3 the full complement of men, provided the other companies, leaving one wide open to speculation. Was establishing the company a way of pandering to Hulbert, who apparently had political pull in the community and had suffered a number of fires at his boarding house and saloon? And the Hulbert Company was located adjacent to the mills. Was it not fully staffed because the lumber mills were considered to be protected by their own forces and not the communities? I don't know. That's one of the big mysteries. Chemical engines were the go-to fighting vehicle of the era. Chemical carts, again, these were pulled by manpower, not horses. Chemical carts were a quick attack fire apparatus of the day. Chemical engines were essentially a fire apparatus equipped with large bicarbonate of soda and acid tanks. At the fire, the cart was tilted for some of the models. Others, they had a plug that you pulled out of them that would cause the stopper to fall out of the acid bottle. The acid mixed with the soda water solution and generated carbon dioxide gas, which propelled the water through the hose and onto the fire. The Sanborn map legend from 1889 revised some of the conditions in the settlement of Washburn. And it does add some insight into the vehicles, the establishment of the department, but also, unfortunately, adds a bit of confusion to the mix as well. The legend notes that the fire department has 2 60-gallon chemical engines and 1 2-gallon chemical engine. A 60-gallon chemical engine isn't much more than a tank on a cart, and a 2-gallon engine would be much more than a handheld fire extinguisher. With 2,000 feet of 2.5-inch rubber hose leading to additional confusion over the founding of the fire department. A search of the community's newspapers of the time have not revealed the purchase by the town of any hose carts. Although the town made significant purchase of equipment for the newly established department, personal protective equipment for the firemen was something of an afterthought. After the Opera House opened at the end of the year, an event was held in the Opera House, a fireman's ball, intended to be a fundraiser for the purchasing of coats, boots, tools, etc. for the fire laddies in order that they may have fully equipped service for the community. Well, let's back up a bit. On November 24th, the Washburn News announced that Washburn Hook and Ladder Company No. 1 and Chemical Engine Company No. 1 had been organized with the following officers and staff. J.A. Sheridan was the foreman, M. Stetter, assistant foreman, D.F. Ross, secretary, Charles Benke, treasurer, Joe Halloran, C.C. Butterfield, Albert Boselile, Oliani, E. Hayek, and James Moley were also members of the company. It also announced that Chemical Engine Company No. 1 was organized with Greenwood as engineer, C.S. Stevens as foreman, R.W. Wright assistant foreman, J.C. Moorhead secretary, C.A. Bombach treasurer, along with the other members of the crew. It does not provide any, I have not found any information yet on the organization of Company No. 2 and Company No. 3. It could be that they're listed in the paper and I missed them, or they just plain aren't listed. I don't know. The news did quip that it hopes the boys will not be called out for a long time to come, but they will no doubt be on hand when the occasion requires them to do effective work. The new department did consider the benefit of training. The paper reported that the fire laddies have talked about testing their abilities one of these days. They propose to put up a small shanty, set fire to it, and then turn in an alarm and see how everything works. It's a very good idea, the paper editorialized, but there isn't any report that the training was actually undertaken. By year's end, the town started getting back to normal, but was still a bit jumpy over the experience. The news reported a couple of Washburnites who were a trifle full of booze started to cry fire at about 2:30 Monday morning and were promptly run in by officers. We've had enough fire without fooling with the business, they said. The new opera block was occupied in the middle of December. The news described the building for its readers as one of the finest opera halls that any town of this size can boast of. The second floor of the building was the hall, with a stage in the front and the entrance at the rear, and on the first floor section of the building were storefronts. The Meehan block, by the first of the year, the big derrick used in construction of the new brownstone Meehan block was dismantled and hauled away along with the stonecutter shed. According to Catherine Eckert, who wrote the book The Sandstone Architecture of the Lake Superior region, she mentioned that the Meehan block was built with sandstone, brownstone from the Washburn Stone Company up in Houghton's Point. They predicted after the derrick was removed from the Meehan block that the building would be occupied within 2 weeks. Shortly thereafter, the famous clothier moved into the new store. The fixtures, counters, showcases, etc. are in keeping with the building itself, which means that they are first class in every respect. The inside work was done by Baptiste and Cook, and it's a credit to them. Mr. Meehan has expended a large amount of money and worked hard to give Washburn the handsome store he now occupies, and will no doubt be rewarded by being given even more liberal patronage than before. But the third week of January '89, Peter Nelson had a new stock for his hardware store, and it does mention his hardware store opened in his new brownstone building, but I haven't found his brownstone building on any of the Sanborn maps I've looked at. I don't know if he had a compartment in the Meehan block, because he had a store on this corner with Meehan before the fire. The Washburn Library was operating once again full force, even though it was not reported as to whether it was operating out of the town hall or other quarters. It was reported that a large number of books were once again in circulation, and a new catalog of its holdings would be issued shortly. Finally, in February of '89, a contract was awarded for the construction of the water system that Washburn had been expecting for several years. There was a problem with the town's legal authority to establish such a water system, but that seemed to have been resolved. A new pump house was constructed June 1st, 1889, down on the waterfront, and an open-air reservoir was constructed on just east of Washington, just west of Washington Avenue, south of Hillside Drive. The pump house is on the left, of course. The reservoir was up on a hill above the current building that's next to the concrete reservoir. That reservoir was filled in as part of the water and sewer project of a couple of years ago. The Great Washburn Fire of 1888 destroyed $118,000 in property value in the heart of the community. Running that number through the web-based CPI inflation calculator suggests that the loss would be the equivalent of $3.7 million in 2023 dollars. Only $570,000 of that were covered by insurance. The community rapidly recovered, prospered, and finally provided the public services necessary to keep the community safe. Finally, the Washburn News ran a bit of cryptic news in its edition of April 22nd, 1898. It read, "The fire Tuesday night reminded some of the old settlers of the big blaze of 1888 when a barn located in nearly the same spot in the block east started the fire, which swept the entire block slick and clean. However, this time we had a splendid system of waterworks to draw on for protection." It didn't mention the fire department. So, in summary, the Washburn Hook and Ladder Company was organized on July 23rd, 1888, and was dissolved the following October or November. The town created an ordinance for a fire department in October or November of 1888, which established Hook and Ladder Company No. 1, Washburn Chemical Company No. 1, and they were both organized on November 24th. It also established Chemical Engine Company No. 2 and Chemical Engine Company No. 3, but I don't know the date of the organization of those two companies. So, is anybody here from the fire department tonight? Dick? I have a can of white paint here, and I have a brush. And would you please wander up to that sign on the door and change that 0 to an 8? Thank you very much.